There's a wind rising in West Africa. It whispers through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, through the farmlands where men and women bend their backs beneath a blazing sun. It speaks of a dream not whispered by foreign tongues, but spoken boldly by the sons of the soil. In the heart of that dream stands one man, Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-statesman, the Burkina Faso president who dared to say, "We will build 7,000 factories in 10 years. Some called it madness. Others called it destiny. Because for too long, Burkina Faso has been trapped in the shadows of poverty, exporting gold and sweat, importing everything else. But now there is movement, a stirring, a promise that the hands of Africa will no longer work for others, but for themselves. This is not just an economic story. This is a story about pride, survival, and resurrection. So stay with me. Subscribe if your heart beats for the rise of Africa. Because tonight we are going to witness the birth of a nation's industrial revolution. They say revolutions are not born in palaces. They are born in the dust, in the hunger of the people, and in the silence of those who have been ignored for too long. When Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso rose to power, he inherited not a throne but a burden. A nation tired of begging, tired of exporting gold while importing bread, tired of sending its sons to die in the desert while its daughters sold peanuts by the roadside. Burkina Faso was a land rich in heart, poor in infrastructure. And that contradiction was the fuel for his fire. He was only in his 30s when he made the promise that would shake the continent. In 10 years, 7,000 factories. Many laughed. Some said, "He's dreaming." But others saw something else. They saw a young man speaking the words his ancestors never had the chance to speak, the words of ownership, of dignity, of economic freedom. In his first 2 years, the movement began slowly. 5 pilot factories were completed, one for tomato processing in Panyongo, one for rice milling near Bobo-Dioulasso, a small textile plant run by veterans of the Revolutionary Army, a solar panel assembly workshop in Kaya, and the National Refining Center for Gold in Ouagadougou. They were modest beginnings, nothing that could change the whole economy, but they carried a symbolic weight that could not be measured in tons or francs. Because for the first time in decades, the raw materials of Burkina Faso were staying home. For the first time, young engineers trained in Ouagadougou were operating machines made in Africa. And for the first time, a generation saw a leader who didn't just speak of sovereignty, but built it, brick by brick. By the end of the 3rd year, 28 more factories had joined the list, mostly small, community-owned, focused on food processing, local construction materials, and solar energy. They were built not by foreign corporations, but by local cooperatives, guided by the state's Industrial Renewal Fund. Traoré's model was simple but radical. 1 province, 10 factories, 1 district, 1 dream. Each province was given industrial blueprints, government seed funding, and mandatory vocational schools to train workers. He called it industrial popularization, turning industry from a distant concept of elites into a daily act of community. There were no grand inaugurations, no golden ribbons, just quiet openings, men and women stepping into workshops that once were empty fields, children walking past walls that smelled of fresh paint, seeing machines whirring for the first time in their lives. But change, no matter how pure, always awakens resistance. As the plan grew, the whispers began, foreign advisors calling it too ambitious, local businessmen worrying they would lose import profits, and opposition parties accusing Traoré of playing socialist experiments. Yet, the factories kept rising. By the 5th year, Burkina Faso had counted over 57 operational plants and 142 under construction. Small, scattered, but alive. Most were cooperatives, owned 51% by local citizens, 49% by the state. And while foreign investors hesitated, one unexpected ally emerged, the Burkinabe diaspora. They began sending remittances directly into industrial bonds, the People's Fund for Factories, turning emotional support into capital. Still, progress came with cracks. Electricity shortages hit several rural factories. Fuel costs rose. Logistics were chaotic. Some roads so poor that trucks needed 2 days to travel 60 kilometers. And corruption, the silent enemy of every African dream, lurked in the shadows, waiting for its chance to choke the movement. But Traoré's government reacted differently this time. Instead of hiding failures, they televised them. On state television every month, ministers reported which projects were delayed, which contractors were suspended, and which new plants had broken ground. Transparency became the new weapon of revolution, and so the people watched, not a perfect journey, but a living one. They watched a young nation struggle, stumble, and stand again. They watched an idea take root in soil long hardened by history. Yet even now, one question still echoed across the land. Can this revolution survive the storms of finance, the droughts of politics, and the gaze of a world that doubts Africa's ability to rise on its own? In the next chapter, we will step inside those factories to see what they are really building. Not just bricks and machines, but a new identity. Because when Africa begins to produce for itself, the world begins to tremble. They began as small lights scattered across a dark map. In the south, the tomato factory at Pognongo hummed with the rhythm of a new dawn, the red of the fruit turning into the red of pride. In the east, a textile plant run by former soldiers stitched garments with a label that read, "Made in Burkina Faso." In the center, the gold refinery melted dust into destiny, no longer shipping it raw to Europe, but refining it on Burkinabe soil. By year 6, those once modest projects had become a movement of hands. Local radio stations broadcast lists of newly opened factories every week. Rice mills, cement mixers, cashew processing units, small motor assembly workshops. There was a sense of rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat that the nation had not felt in decades. Farmers who once sold raw peanuts now delivered to the new peanut oil cooperative in Ouagadougou. Women who used to weave baskets in the market were now part of the Textile Empowerment Union. Young men who dreamed of leaving for Europe stayed home, training in newly built vocational centers to become machine technicians, electricians, and welders. And for the first time, unemployment among the youth dropped, not by miracle, but by muscle. The state announced 73 operational factories by the end of year 6, with 212 under construction. Traoré's speeches became shorter, calmer. He stopped speaking like a revolutionary and began sounding like a builder. Yet, not everyone celebrated. Some business elites saw their profits shrinking, import monopolies breaking apart as local production increased. Foreign partners whispered warnings about protectionism. Global media outlets ran stories questioning the feasibility of building 7,000 factories in a nation still battling insecurity. The Western press painted him as a populist with a dream too large for a fragile state. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, his posters hung beside old revolutionary slogans. We don't dream small, we work big. The people were divided yet strangely united in one feeling. Curiosity. No one knew if it would work, but everyone wanted to see it tried. And in that atmosphere, something deeper changed. The psychology of a nation. Burkina Faso, long told that its only value was what lay underground, its gold, its cotton, began to realize the real treasure was above the soil, its people, their discipline, their will. In a dusty workshop in Bobo-Dioulasso, An old mechanic named Musa was asked by a journalist what he thought of the project. He smiled, his hands black with grease, and said, "When you have nothing, you have two choices, complain or build. Our president chose to build, and that is enough for me. But change brings enemies, not just within borders." Across the ocean, financial institutions began to murmur. Loans were delayed. Aid programs reviewed. Reports described Traoré's economic model as unsustainable, warning of a state-controlled overreach. At the same time, a new wave of African solidarity began to rise. From Mali, Niger, and Guinea, nations with similar struggles, came delegations of engineers and ministers to study the Burkina model. Regional cooperation talks expanded, suggesting shared industrial corridors and energy grids. By year 7, Ouagadougou hosted the first Pan-African Industrial Independence Summit, attended by leaders from 10 West African countries. It was no longer just about factories. It was about an awakening. Still, Traoré faced a harsh reality. Production was growing, but logistics lagged. Many plants operated below capacity due to power shortages. The National Electric Company could not keep up with the industrial boom, and the roads, old, broken, and narrow, turned progress into frustration. One truck driver told the press, "We can make the bricks faster than we can move them," and that was the truth. Progress was no longer blocked by belief. It was blocked by infrastructure. For every new factory built, the roads demanded 2 more. For every machine installed, the grid needed twice the energy. The world watched, some with admiration, others with suspicion. The IMF released a report suggesting Burkina Faso was approaching fiscal overextension. But Traoré stood firm, insisting the factories were not expenses. They were investments in sovereignty. At a national address marking the 7th year of the plan, he said slowly, "They say our hands are too small to build, but these hands have built nations before. We will build again." The crowd thundered. For a moment, the fear of failure drowned in the sound of hope. But hope is a fragile seed. It needs rain, and sometimes that rain doesn't come. Because just as Burkina Faso began to rise from the dust, new storms gathered, shortages, debts, and doubt. The factories had been built, but could they survive? In the next chapter, we step into the heart of the struggle, where progress meets its greatest enemy, the weight of reality. Every great dream must one day face the test of fire. For Burkina Faso, that fire came not from war, but from within. By the 8th year of the industrial plan, the nation had already built 126 factories, with another 364 in progress. On paper, it looked like victory. In reality, cracks had begun to show. Power shortages paralyzed entire regions. Machines stood silent for days, waiting for electricity that never came. The Ministry of Industry reported that 1/3 of new factories were operating at less than 50% capacity. Raw materials piled up, finished goods waited for trucks that could not reach markets. The people had built walls, roofs, machines. But the invisible arteries of a nation, the logistics and the grids, were still weak. And then came the drought. 2 years of poor rain ravaged crops. Food prices soared. The factories meant to process local produce had nothing to process. In Ouagadougou, the once busy maize processing plant shut down for 3 months. Workers went home unpaid. One man, a father of 4, told the national radio, "We thought the factory would save us, but without rain, no machine can feed my children." The government responded with emergency funding, subsidies, loans, industrial bonds. But the debt grew heavy. International lenders raised alarms, calling Traoré's industrial campaign an economic overreach. The Burkina Faso president was accused of running the country like a battlefield instead of a business. The opposition, long quiet, found its voice again. They claimed the 7,000 factory plan was unrealistic, a slogan to buy loyalty, not a strategy to build stability. Some demanded audits, others protests. And in the foreign press, headlines began to turn bitter. The African industrial dream falters. Traoré's factories face collapse. But inside the country, a different truth simmered. Frustration, yes, but also ownership. People were angry not because they had failed, but because, for once, they had something worth fighting for. In the streets of Ouagadougou, citizens formed local committees to adopt idle factories. They repaired equipment, shared fuel, took turns keeping production alive. No orders from the top, just people refusing to give up on what was theirs. And still, the government pressed on. Solar panels were installed to power 10 of the most remote plants. Hydroelectric projects broke ground along the Black Volta River. New trade routes opened toward Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. It wasn't enough to win back momentum, but it was enough to keep hope alive. And yet hope came with a heavy cost. Inflation hit double digits. Imports of machinery drained foreign currency reserves. The treasury grew thin. By the 9th year, rumors spread that the Industrial Renewal Fund, the heart of Traoré's plan, was running dry. The president appeared on television, calm but resolute, and said, "A revolution does not end when the budget is low. It ends when the spirit breaks. Ours will not break." But behind the cameras, even his allies began to worry. How long could the country keep building when the world refused to believe in it? Could Burkina Faso survive its own ambition? Then came the moment that would define it all. A fire, small, accidental, yet symbolic, broke out in the Ouagadougou textile plant. Flames tore through machines bought with sweat and sacrifice. Men cried not because of the loss of property, but because it felt like the loss of a dream. When Traoré visited the site, the crowd was silent. He stood before the ashes and said only one line: "We will build again. Even if it burns 10 times, we will build again." And somehow that single sentence traveled farther than any policy, any plan. It became the chant of a weary nation refusing to kneel. But beneath the roar of that defiance lingered the question everyone was too afraid to ask. What if this time the dream cannot be rebuilt? So I ask you, how many of those 7,000 factories will still stand 10 years from now? Will they rise or will they rust? And does a nation truly fail if its people keep fighting to build? Tell me in the comments, do you believe Burkina Faso's revolution is still alive? Or has it already become a legend? When a small nation begins to build, the world begins to whisper. In Washington, the analysts of the IMF adjusted their glasses and frowned over charts that refused to make sense. In Brussels, committees debated whether Burkina Faso's economic nationalism threatened the stability of West African trade. And in Beijing, they watched in quiet admiration because they recognized the rhythm, a young nation chasing self-reliance through the fire of discipline. What the West called unsustainable, the East called courage. And what the old powers mocked as ambition beyond capacity, the African people hailed as the return of dignity. The Burkina Faso president had not merely built factories, he had built a statement, a message that echoed across the continent. Africa can rise without permission. Neighboring Mali and Niger began drafting their own industrial blueprints. Ghana opened talks about shared trade corridors for locally made goods. Even in Nigeria, journalists debated whether the Burkina model could be replicated in larger economies. For the first time in decades, A landlocked nation had become the epicenter of an idea, and the world took notice. France, once the colonial power, began to lose its grip, politically, economically, emotionally. Its companies found fewer contracts, its advisors fewer meetings. The air of dependency began to thin, replaced by something unfamiliar: self-respect. Traoré's government, despite its hardships, had forged new partnerships, with Russia for machinery, with Turkey for textiles, and with regional African banks for financing. It wasn't ideology, it was survival, the kind of survival that redefines sovereignty. By the 10th year, though still far from its target, Burkina Faso had achieved a visible shift. Manufacturing output up by 42%, rural employment up by 30%, export dependency on Europe down from 70% to 48%, and perhaps most symbolically, more than half of the nation's school curriculum now included technical training, a transformation not yet complete, but unmistakably begun. International newspapers, once skeptical, began to soften. The Financial Times called it a stubborn miracle. Le Monde called it the echo of Africa's forgotten potential. But beneath the applause and criticism lay the same question that haunted every outsider. What happens next? Because revolutions do not end with applause. They end with accountability. And in the silence between those headlines, the burden returned once more to the soil of Burkina Faso, to the hands that had built and bled for this dream. The world is watching now. The applause has begun, but applause fades, and factories like faith must be maintained. So what will happen when the cameras turn away? In the next chapter, we step into the hardest truth of all: the road ahead. The noise has quieted now. The speeches have ended. The headlines have faded from the front pages. What remains is the sound of hammers, not from celebration, but continuation. 10 years have passed since Ibrahim Traoré spoke those daring words. 7,000 factories. He built not all, but enough to prove the impossible could be touched. Enough to make the world pause and ask, what if he was right? But revolutions, my brothers and sisters, are not measured by numbers. They are measured by endurance. Can the people of Burkina Faso carry this vision beyond one man, beyond one decade, beyond one presidency? Because history tells us movements that live only through a leader die when he rests. But movements that live in the hearts of the people become eternal. Across Burkina Faso today, the echo of industry is still alive. The National Training Institute continues to teach hundreds of young men and women each month: machinists, engineers, electricians. In Bobo-Dioulasso, retired workers from the first generation of plants now train apprentices for free. In the countryside, cooperatives have evolved into unions, small, resilient, determined to keep production alive even when the state struggles. The government has announced the second phase, from factories to innovation. It's no longer just about making goods, it's about inventing, adapting, creating. Solar-powered machines built by Burkinabe hands, agricultural drones designed in local labs. It is slow, uneven, fragile, but it's there. And outside, the world still watches. In the United States, black scholars on community radio speak of Traoré's legacy with awe. He reminded us that sovereignty is not a flag, it's a factory. From Harlem to Atlanta, elders in the African diaspora whisper his name in church halls and barbershops, not as a politician, but as a symbol of persistence. A man who refused to believe that Africa was destined to remain a supplier of raw pain and raw gold. But there is still danger. Power struggles simmer beneath the surface. A younger generation, impatient for results, demands faster progress. Foreign investors, sensing opportunity, circle like hawks. And the debt, always the debt, hangs over the nation like a cloud that refuses to move. The road ahead will not be smooth. There will be droughts, disappointments, betrayals. But every nation that ever rose through storms. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of this decade-long dream. Not the factories themselves, but the faith they built. A faith that says, we can. A faith that says, we must. A faith that says, we will. And as the dust of progress settles, one question remains. When the next generation looks back, will they say Traoré built factories? Or did he build a future? Because the story of Burkina Faso is not over. It is only beginning. There are stories that fade with time, and there are stories that ripen with time. The tale of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, is not a headline. It is a heartbeat. He did not promise paradise. He promised work. He did not speak of miracles. He spoke of machines, sweat, and soil. And through every triumph and every scar, the nation learned a truth older than any constitution. Freedom is not declared. Freedom is built. There was anger. Oh yes, anger at the centuries of extraction, at the foreign hands that dug gold and left dust. There was sorrow. For the factories that fell silent, the workers unpaid, the debts unpaid. And yet, there was hope, burning like a forge in the hearts of men and women who refused to surrender to despair. Today, Burkina Faso stands not as a finished dream, but as a living lesson. A lesson that the road to dignity is never paved with comfort. It is paved with courage, with broken tools, and unbroken faith. And for the first time in generations, a Burkina Faso president stood before the world and said, "We are not asking for permission to rise. We are simply rising." In the markets, in the workshops, in the dusty villages where the hum of machines now replaces the silence of resignation, you can feel it. The dream lives on. So I ask you, do you believe in this new Africa? Do you believe that nations like Burkina Faso can craft their own destiny? Because this is not only Traoré's story, it is our story, the story of every people who have ever been told they were too poor, too small, too late. If you feel that fire, if you believe that faith, hit that subscribe button. Because we will keep watching, keep telling, keep praying for the hands that build. The factories may rise and fall, the leaders may come and go, but the spirit, the unbreakable spirit of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, will endure. What do you believe matters more? The number of factories built or the faith they inspired? Tell me in the comments below.